I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we will be discussing the issue of shipbuilding, which has recently emerged as a crucial focal point of U.S. China competition. Just how dominant is China in the global commercial shipbuilding industry, and how did China become such a prominent player? How does the commercial shipbuilding tie with naval shipbuilding, and what are the implications of that for U.S. and allied security? To explore these questions, we're joined by two experts who have analyzed these issues in recent separate publications, Dr. Matthew Funaiole and Dr. Eric Labs. My CSIS colleague, Dr. Matthew Funaiole, is Vice President of the Ideas Lab, Andreas C. Dracopoulos Chair in Innovation, and Senior Fellow with the ChinaPower Project. In 2022, he launched the CSIS Hidden Reach Initiative, which leverages open source intelligence to uncover poorly understood sources of Chinese influence and examine how China advances its strategic interests through commercial and scientific ventures. He is co-author of a recent CSIS report titled Ship Wars: Confronting China's Dual-Use Shipbuilding Empire, which he wrote with Brian Hart and Aidan Powers-Riggs. Dr. Eric Labs is the Senior Analyst for Naval Forces and Weapons at the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C. He specializes in issues related to the procurement, budgeting, and sizing of the forces for the Department of Navy. He is co-author with Stephen Biddle of a recent Foreign Affairs article titled, Does America Face a Ship Gap with China? Matthew and Eric, thank you for joining me in this podcast. So I'd like to begin by setting the scene a bit, and I would like to ask both of you to describe your research on this issue and why you decided to write about it. I know that there are two separate pieces that we're talking about, so maybe Eric, we can start with you first, and then we can turn to Matthew.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So most of my job at CBO as the CBO's naval analyst is analyzing and studying issues of the U.S. Navy for the Congress. CBO is one of three congressional support agencies that work for the Congress, not for the president. And it's my job to do, nonpartisan objective analysis. So in the course of doing this work for the past 30 years or so, that's how long I've been in the job, it's become increasingly relevant, especially in the last decade and the last few years in particular, that China's aggressive shipbuilding efforts are going to shape the way the U.S. Navy thinks about its strategy and its fleet. So consequently, paying attention to China is in effect an important part of my job. When Foreign Affairs approached my co-author, Steve Biddle of Columbia University, about writing an article on the ship gap, that was their term, between the U.S. and China. China now has a larger fleet than the U.S. by ship numbers, but not necessarily by some other measures. He asked if I wanted to do it or at least co-author the article with him. So I signed up for the idea of the co-authorship, and I suggested the thesis that the article ultimately became in Foreign Affairs. It's increasingly relevant because China is not acting like a benign status quo power, but one that wants to, upend the geopolitical world order. Its large and growing Navy will be a critical tool in its arsenal to do that. So, combined with the severe troubles in both naval and the maritime world in the U.S., that suggests a very worrisome long-term trend for the balance of power in the Western Pacific and ultimately, in my view, globally.
And Eric, before we turn to Matthew, what was the main thesis that you argued in your Foreign Affairs article?
So the main thesis in the Foreign Affairs article is that regardless of what sort of the current ship gap, in other words, the differential between the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy is today in terms of numbers, because you can weigh that different ways. They have more ships. Our ships are larger displacement and more capable weapon systems, and it's a better trained Navy. The thing that I worry about is the long-term trend of relative industrial capacity. Not unlike the beginning of World War II, where Japan had a very high-quality Navy, and we'll talk about this more later during the course of the podcast, if you like, and the U.S. had a larger Navy, the U.S. also had much greater industrial capacity than Japan. So the Japan hoped that their better quality Navy would inflict some blows against us and then force the U.S. to sue for peace. Whereas today, I think those roles are kind of reversed. The United States has got the somewhat smaller but higher quality Navy, but we don't have the industrial capacity. China is where the United States was in 1940. They have an enormous shipbuilding industrial capacity. So a long-term naval arms race, if you will, or even a post-war scenario in which maybe both sides have lost a certain number of ships, China is much better positioned to be able to replace those losses or compete on a long-term industrial basis than the United States is today.
Thank you, Eric. And I think that's a good segue to Matthew's CSIS article that he also co-authored looking at China's dual-use shipbuilding empire. Matthew, can you share with us what were some of your main findings and the arguments in your article or your report?
Yeah, for sure. And, thanks, Bonnie, for having me on. I do think it's a natural segue here. The team at CSIS, we've been looking at this issue of Chinese shipyards for quite some time. We started Chinese naval modernization, and in the process of that, started to notice a lot of blurring in terms of naval and commercial production at some of the key shipyards in China. And as we were kind of just doing our, kind of nerdy thing and, looking at satellite imagery and trying to get as much data together as possible, there's just been this huge surge of interest in the policy community in DC. It really started under the Biden administration, but it's escalated under the Trump administration, where now there is just this pretty profound realization, and as sort of Eric mentioned, that U.S. shipbuilding is not in a great place. We're at a sort of massive disadvantage when it comes to China when we look at our different industrial bases. And so it raises this question, right, of how do we compete with China in this specific context? But the issue that we saw, and one of the things we wanted to address with the report, is that the conversations were somewhat siloed, right? There was the folks that were focused on the economic side of it, right? Did China use unfair economic practices to gain an upper hand and corner the market? And then there's the security dimension of it as well, right? And that's closer to what sort of Eric was talking about. But one of the points that we make in the report is that you really can't separate the two of them. You shouldn't separate the two of them, especially when it comes to China. And so we wanted to show very clearly that these are very much intertwined with each other, especially in the case of China. And so what we did is we went out and we studied all 307 active Chinese shipyards, and we used a variety of different open source tools to do that, and built a data set to show which are the ones that are most closely tied to Chinese naval modernization, which ones are state-owned, which ones are, I'm making air quotes here, you can't see it on a podcast, but are sort of privately owned, and which ones just appear to be engaged in commercial production. And what that really does is it changes the focus, right? It changes the focus to not necessarily just be about ships, but the shipyards themselves, the actors that are involved, and the capital and the technology that is flowing into those shipyards and the risks that it poses for the U.S.
And Matthew, in your research of the 300 plus active Chinese shipyards, which ones were most closely tied to the PLA and China's naval modernization?
We have a sort of a big list of them that we kind of produced in the report. But if you look at the 307, there's about 12 that are the most important in terms of providing different benefits for the PLA. You have ones like Jiangnan, which are really essential for the third carrier production. Is also where you see the Type 55s being produced. Dalian is also essential to Type 55 production. There's a few other key ones as well. And then there's some smaller shipyards in that sort of group of 12 that are really engaged in just producing different components for PLA surface combatants. But what stands out, right, is if you look at these shipyards, massive shipyards, I would encourage anyone who's listening to just kind of go out, look at the report and look at, Google Earth and kind of just get a sense, because we're talking about things that are, comparable in size to Midtown Manhattan, right? These are just absolute massive industrial bases. But if you look at what's going on there, you just see these military vessels being produced alongside commercial vessels. And that raises a lot of questions about who is in sort of engaging these companies in business. And in a lot of cases, they're actually European companies that are sort of buying from these shipyards. And Japan and Korea as well are buying from the shipyards. Taiwan as well is buying from the shipyards. And that raises a lot of concerns about the ways in which foreign capital and tech is flowing in and the ways that it might be helping China to offset some of the costs and bring some of the technology in for upgrading its navy.
And Matthew, maybe I'll direct this question to you first, but I'd also love for Eric to weigh in here. Both of you are arguing that China is a lot more, advanced and doing better in terms of the commercial shipbuilding industry. But how far ahead is China, and how did China become so dominant?
I'll start off and I'll pass it over there. It's not a pretty picture, Bonnie. I mean, it's like a pretty dire picture. I mean, the standout stat that we use in the report and we kind of post on social media, and I think a lot of people have gravitated to, is that just one Chinese shipbuilder, that CSSC that we can talk about later, it built more vessels by tonnage, right, last year than the entire U.S. industry has built since the end of World War II. So that, just to give you a sense of the disparity in the commercial tonnage output between China and the U.S. And there's other ways that you can cut that, right? The U.S. is 0.1% of global output. On a good year, we're making maybe 5 large ocean-going vessels, so it's a pretty small sort of share. And China's around 50% of global output, and the remaining bit there is kind of split between Japan and Korea. But this has really been a familiar story for folks, I'm sure, that listen to the podcast and that kind of follow this. It's a familiar story when it comes to Chinese industrial policy, right? This is an area that they recognized as significant and important. They spent a couple decades pouring subsidies into the industry. Some of the studies that we've seen, this is not our research, but up to about $100 billion worth of subsidies into the shipbuilding industry. And then offsetting that, or adding on to that with things like cheap land for the shipyards themselves, steel inputs at a heavily discounted cost, free energy, right? You just have this huge industrial capacity to build it up. And so what you kind of saw throughout the sort of mid 2000s was hundreds of new shipyards kind of popping up, or these little kind of dinky shipyards kind of converting into these much more substantial industrial projects. The capacity wasn't great there. Capabilities weren't great there at first, but they sort of improved over time. And then you kind of had a constriction in the market after the financial collapse, and you had a process of consolidation in China where it went through, and it actually used to have much more than 307 shipyards. And it identified the ones that were most effective, right? And the ones that were going to be the state-owned champions, the ones that were going to get all the contracts for naval modernization. And the funds really started to flow into there. And China's just been able to, as we've seen in other industries, really just chip away at the market year over year, bring industrial scales into the fold. And now you have a place where it started off the 2000s at less than 5% of global output. Now it's over 50%. And the order book suggests that that's going to continue to grow unless something changes.
It's hard for me to actually improve upon what Matthew just said. I guess what I'll do is I'll just foot stomp on 2 points. One is that this was very much a conscious policy choice by the Chinese government to engage in capturing a huge amount of the commercial shipbuilding market and then therefore have a robust industrial base to supplement and to be able to enhance their naval shipbuilding industry. The United States had already lost its position in the commercial shipbuilding market long before China made this policy decision. So the United States had a brief period after World War II when it was the dominant commercial shipbuilder. But in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it lost all of that position to Japan and South Korea. So what China has been doing to become actively the dominant player in this field is taking market share from Japan and Korea. They're the ones who have lost to China in this process. And the U.S. lost market share to those countries and obviously now to China today, partly because they had simply had more competitive labor markets in which to do this. They were paying their workers less than U.S. shipyards were paying its workers. And in the early 1980s, the United States, as a matter of policy, ended what was called the commercial differential subsidy, which was a mechanism by which the U.S. government would pay U.S. shipbuilders to build commercial ships and sort of compensate for the difference between what the Koreans and the Japanese could build ships for to sort of keep that in place. So once that decision had been made, there was really very few commercial ships that are going to be built in U.S. markets because we were just not competitive anymore with the Japanese and the Koreans, much less the Chinese then in the 2000s.
On your point about how the United States has lost our position in the commercial shipbuilding market, I think it would be useful to take a step back and just question, why is this so important? Why do we need to have a dominant position? And that brings me back to your Foreign Affairs article in which you talk about the impact of shipbuilding and that industrial capacity on the course of World War II. Could you share with us, Eric, why it's important for us to maintain this industrial capacity and how did it impact the course of World War II?
At the outbreak of World War II, the United States' greatest strength was its vast industrial might, and ship construction was a key component of that. So when Japan attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy and the U.S. Navy were sort of roughly equal in size in the Pacific, although the U.S. Navy was significantly larger overall, but it devoted, a portion of its fleet to the Atlantic Ocean. Japan did have more aircraft carriers than the U.S. at that time, and the Japanese Navy was at the start, better trained, often had better equipment than the U.S. Navy. The carrier strike force that Japan used so effectively in the first 6 months of the war, that would become the standard for carrier fleet operations, and that was really kind of a Japanese invention. Japan hoped it would win a string of victories, land a series of knockout blows against the U.S. Navy in the hopes, as I mentioned earlier, that the U.S. would then sue for peace after that. But after Japan lost the Battle of Midway, losing with it a significant portion of its carrier force, it was clear that the U.S. was not going to sue for peace, but instead turn its massive industrial advantage against Japan. In the 4 years prior to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and Japan produced almost the same amount of naval tonnage. But as the U.S. engaged in a massive naval buildup because of its vast industrial capability that it had available to it, in response to the Japanese provocations of the Pacific, Japan recognized it would not be able to compete industrially. So it had planned to compensate for that inevitable inferiority in quantity with quality, better weapons, ships, and skills. But after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. outproduced Japan in naval tonnage by over 6-1. U.S. training, tactics, strategy, weapons, and ships, all of that improved substantially as the war went on. But ultimately, the United States overwhelmed Japan by dramatically outbuilding it. As I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, today I fear our roles are reversed when it comes to any potential conflict with China. It is China with the vastly superior shipbuilding industrial base compared to the U.S. The U.S. still builds better quality ships and has a very well-trained Navy, and it rightly and proudly says so. But in a long war, or even an indecisive war that leads to, say, roughly equal losses on both sides, perhaps even China loses somewhat more ships in such a potential war, it will be China's vast industrial potential that can compensate for the losses in a way that the U.S. naval shipbuilding industry is no longer able to.
This might be outside the scope of what Eric, either you or Matthew are comfortable asking, but when it comes to looking at U.S. advantages vis-a-vis China in either a long war or an indecisive war, one of the advantages we have are our allies and partners. And Eric, you mentioned that Japan and South Korea used to be dominant in the shipbuilding industry before China overtook them. If we were to add to the U.S. equation the advantages of Japan and South Korea, would that get us closer to balancing the advantage that China has in the industrial capacity for shipbuilding?
If you look at the amount of production that both Korea and Japan produce, both naval and commercial, I think the answer is kind of yes, and I'll be interested to hear whether Matthew agrees with that. So Japan and Korea together have about roughly an equal amount to what China is producing today. And in fact, there was an article just a few days ago, one of the Korean shipbuilders, offered to build, 5 destroyers a year for the United States if we were so inclined to purchase them for them. And we can talk about this more later on, but that's a conversation that's probably worth having about our need to, if we're going to be engaging in a long-term naval arms race with China, the United States may not be in a position to win it on its own, and it's going to need the industrial capacity of its allies to help with that.
That's right. I mean, there's a couple of factors, right? So the shipbuilding industry in both Japan and South Korea is robust, although it may be struggling a little bit as a result of what China's able to do, right? If you go back, there was a point in time where Japan and South Korea were like 75% of the global market. Now today they're less than 50%. So certainly still dominant players. To put a really fine point on it, I don't see any path forward for the United States to rebuild its capacity or rebuild some capacity here without working with Japan and South Korea, right? They are the two other leaders in this area. And it's not just on the industrial side of it. It's also the personnel and the knowledge and the technology side of it as well, where we have two allies that we could work with to help rebuild some capacity at home. I do think there's a challenge here, though, right? During peacetime, certainly, and maybe a naval arms race, there could be a lot of overlap there and a way of working together on things. I don't know what happens if we are actually in a protracted conflict, because at that point, you might also anticipate that Japan, for instance, is also losing forces, is going to have to redirect some of its commercial capability toward offsetting those losses. And so certainly I think there's things that could be done right now to help enhance in both building up U.S. capacity to trying to drive more capacity into Japan and South Korea so it can compete more effectively with China on the commercial side of things. And that all works great, again, during peacetime. I don't know what happens if things turn into a conflict. I think it's a little bit more complicated then.
And Matthew, if you don't mind, I did want to maybe play the devil's advocate here. If we're really thinking about a protracted conflict between the United States and China, that could involve significant damages to our existing naval fleet. I guess the question I would have is, why would that conflict not escalate to the nuclear level or to escalate significantly such that we wouldn't actually be in a position where we would necessarily be able to continue the war too long and need to, for example, build more ships? What scenarios can you share with us in which we really expect the United States and China to be locked in a protracted conflict in which the size of our naval fleet or maritime forces could be very important?
I think, Bonnie, you're probably the best person on this call to actually answer that question. I will get started, but I can think that Eric and Bonnie, I think you both have insights on it. I mean, that's obviously a problem, right? Or that's obviously an issue. Like, you can always pull the trump card of, well, if the U.S. and China are engaged in any type of protracted conflict, there's also always the risk of nuclear escalation. And what that means is you don't actually need to have any industrial capacity. But I'm cribbing from Bonnie here, so I feel a little bit bad. But, there are a number of scenarios in relation to something like Taiwan, right? And Taiwan contingencies that could remain below that threshold in which there could be a loss of forces on both sides. But I'd argue you need to broaden the conversation out here a little bit. it's not just about ships, right? I mean, we're talking about ships, but what we're really talking about is industrial capacity to support any type of war effort. You also need munitions, right, in any type of conflict. And I don't think that the United States, because we have neglected our industrial base, has the munitions necessary for a protracted conflict that might go on where maybe you don't necessarily have a tremendous amount of naval losses, but you do have a lot of use of munitions that you need to be able to resupply. But there's other aspects to this as well, right? If the U.S. is conducting any type of prolonged overseas engagement involving its naval forces, they're going to necessarily sustain losses, but they are going to sustain some wear and tear. And the U.S. struggles with its ability to support refitting and refueling and maintaining its current fleet where it's at right now. Even during peacetime, we have a deficit when it comes to our ability to really support things. I'll add one more thing on there, and I'll sort of turn it over to Eric, because I'm sure he'll have thoughts on it. There's also a logistics aspect that often gets neglected when we're sort of talking about this. Imagine the U.S. being engaged in an overseas conflict that doesn't necessarily directly involve China, but that does involve the United States needing to be able to resupply its forward position wherever that necessarily is. What would be really helpful in those kind of situations is having a commercial fleet to lean on for logistics support, right? I mean, not all of those goods, munitions, fuel are going to be transported just upon naval vessels, right? You're going to need some backbone of a merchant fleet or merchant marines to really be able to supply a prolonged conflict. It doesn't necessarily matter where that is globally, but if it's not on the U.S. shores, you're going to need to have some level of logistics support. And right now, the U.S. does not have the capacity to do that. And it'd be hard to see how it would sustain those kind of operations without building up or having access to some type of strategic sea lift. But Eric, I'll turn it over to you with that.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great. And Bonnie, that's a really good question. It's a complicated question, and there's different scenarios one can imagine. So, for example, I do think you're right that there is a great deal of risk of nuclear escalation in such a conflict between the U.S. and China. Some people have argued, for example, that in a war, the Chinese shipyards aren't going to last because the United States would hit them. Well, that involves doing a lot of damage to the Chinese mainland. It's hard to see a scenario in which that happens, in which we are successful doing that doesn't carry with it great risks of escalation and escalation, above the nuclear thresholds. So I think that is a real concern. But let's spin a scenario where maybe escalation does not occur. So, for example, let's say it's similar to what happens in the early stages of World War II, where the United States holds its own in a war in the Western Pacific. Maybe it's over an invasion of Taiwan or something else. It inflicts, more damage on the Chinese Navy than the Chinese Navy inflicts on the United States. What happens then? Some people have argued, China might become unstable domestically. That's true. But what if it doesn't? Or that China would then sort of want to get out of that war before domestic politics interferes. And that's certainly a possibility. But what if it doesn't? In that scenario, China then carries on the same way the United States carried on in the early stages of World War II. And that's where its industrial capacity starts to weigh in more, particularly as Matthew emphasized munitions. We're probably going to run out of, precision munitions for ships before we're going to run out of ships. That's a big concern because China, too, as Matthew mentioned, has the ability to replace those munitions faster than we do. And so this overall industrial capacity is an issue, not just in shipbuilding, but in munitions and in other areas. I'm not going to repeat what Matthew said about logistics, but he's dead on about that. China is better placed to sort of maintain a very robust logistics and resupply capability than the United States is today.
Well, great. Thank you both. I guess the one thing I would add to that is, as we're looking at a more complex world in which China has stronger relationships with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and potentially even other problematic actors moving forward, I think one of the things that the United States does need to worry about is simultaneous contingencies and opportunistic aggression. China having greater industrial capacity than us and the strains that these other problematic actors may pose on the United States could really provide a benefit, even for a shorter term conflict, because of the strain on the United States industrial capacity. But going back to your reports, Matthew, for your report, you focused on the links between China's commercial shipbuilding industry and China's naval shipbuilding power. Can you explain a little bit more about how these dual-use shipbuilding model benefits China? I was particularly struck by your mentioning of how European, Japanese, and Korean, and I think you also mentioned Taiwan, orders commercial ships from these Chinese shipyards. To what extent are they aware of the dual-use nature of these shipyards, and how much does that impact their willingness to still buy from China?
Great question, Bonnie, and one that I've asked myself several times. I think anyone who takes a good look at the shipyards that are producing a lot of these commercial orders for the companies based in the countries that you mentioned would have to notice that they're getting ships delivered, especially if they're going to inspect them or they're getting reports of them. They're getting produced at some of these key dual-use shipyards. There's a plethora of evidence that suggests that these things are happening alongside of each other. And in many cases, the same dry docks and gantry trains are being used for those levels of production. But the model is central to China. I want to break down a couple of components there and maybe combat some of the, I think, not necessarily false narratives, but spurious narratives when it comes to really looking at this issue. The key shipyards, the ones that we really focus on in the report as being the biggest issues, the ones that are red flags that we need to try to actively encourage countries to not buy from. These are massive industrial projects. I mean, they're huge projects. And what we have seen over the last several years that we've been studying them is just this ongoing fusing together of the commercial and naval production, which is very much in line with China's military civil fusion strategy, right? It wants the economic and the national security elements to be fused together. And in the process, it's simultaneously leveling up its industrial capacity, its defense capacity, and its broader economy. And most of this activity is really happening under one massive shipbuilding group, CSSC, the China State Shipbuilding Corporation. This is the largest commercial ship producer in the world, and it has hundreds of subsidiaries. So it can be a little bit difficult to kind of keep track of things because many of these shipyards are run by a subsidiary or a subsidiary of two of the subsidiary. And so if you're purchasing commercial vessels from a Chinese entity, you may not know, if you don't do due diligence or if there's really just that much opacity about it, whether or not this ties back into the sort of parent umbrella CSSC shipbuilding group that's the one that's getting all the contracts for the PLA Navy. But if you do a little bit of digging, it's pretty obvious that is what's occurring. And so for us, the way that we don't need to go into too much detail on this, but the way that we classified it at the shipyards that are the biggest problems, these are the CSSC owned ones, both the ones that are engaged directly in military production or the ones that are primarily commercial, but that are supporting military production through things like technology transfers and revenue transfers, things of that nature. 75% of the commercial production at the dual-use CSSC shipyards are going to foreign buyers, right? And you highlighted some of them, Bonnie, at the beginning. CMA CGM, which is a French company. MSC, one, which is Japanese, right? So the Japanese and Koreans are also buying from China. And the last one you mentioned is Evergreen, right? Evergreen is one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, based in Taiwan. And they are buying a lot of ships from these dual-use shipyards. And we've released satellite imagery that just directly shows Evergreen vessels being built alongside of Type 55s and Type 52s, oftentimes at the same, T-shaped pier, or oftentimes right next to the third aircraft carrier that China's producing. And so this evidence is very much out there. And what we see in the process of that is that billions and billions of dollars are flowing into these shipyards. There is absolutely no transparency into what's going on with that capital once it gets into Chinese shipyards. But what we do know is that it very much appears from the evidence that we have that that's helping to offset things like some of the marginal fixed costs that you would see for a massive naval buildup, right? The infrastructure costs, some of the material inputs, the personnel costs. If you have a direct channel in which billions of foreign capital is flowing into the same location where you're also building up your Navy, you're going to see some benefits from there. I'll add one more point on and definitely be interested in hearing Eric's thoughts on this. There is a kind of counter narrative that has emerged that this actually isn't that efficient, that this actually creates more headaches for China than it's worth. And I think that that's very much derived from Americans looking at the problem and being like, well, this wouldn't work for us, so it can't be good for China. And I don't think that's the right way to frame the problem. I'm not suggesting, and I don't think most of the folks that are kind of working on this are suggesting, that the U.S. adopt the Chinese model and try to have that be how we build up our own industrial capacity. But the evidence is pretty clear here that China sees a strategic value in this, and it has doubled down on this model. And we know that because the shipyards that are expanding, the ones that are getting the state contract, These are those massive dual-use shipyards, and over time, they're just more and more blurring between the commercial and military production. It's working for China. That doesn't mean this is the model that is for the U.S., and foreign capital and also foreign technology is helping to upgrade this process, which has dividends for the PLA as well.
Matthew, before we turn to Eric, I just want to make sure I understood the statistic you shared. So you said 70% of the ships produced at these dual-use shipyards are purchased by foreigners. And I think earlier you also said that these dual-use shipyards are some of the largest shipyards among the 300 plus ones that you looked at. So would it be fair to say that foreign purchases of Chinese ships are funding a significant portion, if not close to 50% of some of the ships built at Chinese shipyards?
So yeah, putting an exact number on it is difficult, right? Because who knows how much a Type 55 costs to produce? I can't answer that question. But numbers that we do have that come out of our research is that of what we call tier 1 shipyards in our report. Now, these are the ones that are CSSC shipyards that are directly responsible for naval production or components that go into naval assets. There's only 12 of them, about a dozen of them, and they are responsible for about 17% of the total output of China's commercial production, right? So China's biggest producer in the world, 12 shipyards are responsible for 17% of its output. And really, there's only like 4 to 6 that are really, really engaged in that. And they're responsible for about 15% of the output. So massive amount of capacity at these shipyards. Those shipyards, and also at some other CSSC shipyards, all of the sort of CSSC shipyards combined, it's actually 75% of the commercial orders are for foreign clients. So 25% are going to Chinese companies, 75% are going to foreign clients. Now, that, again, is the evidence that we have. What we don't have insight on is how much the revenue from, Qatar buying, X billion dollars worth of vessels from China funnels directly into the PLA. But it's hard for me to see a world in which the revenue that is being generated, which is helping to sponsor the massive modernization and expansion of these shipyards, isn't in a significant way offsetting the costs for naval production.
Great, thank you. Eric, over to you if you want to weigh in on the advantages to China from the dual-use shipyards, or if you would like to share with us, how does this compare to the U.S. naval shipbuilding industry?
Sure. Matthew did a really great job at that. And I guess the one thing I would add to it is that the Chinese model is different also from the Korean and the Japanese models. They don't do it quite the same way. There's much stronger separation in their yards between the commercial shipbuilding activities and the naval shipbuilding activities. I mean, so much so that like in a major Korean yard, they've got barbed wire around the part of the yard that is building naval ship construction. And in Japan, in a number of places, they have completely bifurcated the naval from the commercial sector. So what the Chinese are doing is different from what the other major shipbuilding producers are doing. With respect to sort of zeroing in on the question of the naval shipbuilding industry and how the U.S. compares to China, China is steadily producing more naval ships than the United States year in and year out now. I mean, so much so that since 2000, the Chinese fleet has doubled in size, whereas the U.S. Navy has remained about the same size. That doubling in size is also the fact that within that, they've improved the quality and the capabilities and the capacity of those naval ships that they've built. Now, from what we know so far, they are perhaps not as quite a good a quality as the U.S. ships are, but they are improving all the time. As Steve Biddle and I said in the Foreign Affairs article, that quality gap is closing, relatively rapidly. So that's in a naval arms race. You think of the kind of naval arms race that occurred between Britain and Germany before World War I. China is extremely well positioned to win it from an industrial perspective. With respect to the resources for the U.S., money has not actually been that much of a problem year in and year out over the past decade. The one presidential administration after another, regardless of the party affiliation, has requested more and more money for shipbuilding. And year in and year out, the Congress has added more money to those requests. So much so, the Navy's shipbuilding budget has grown at over 6% a year for the past 20 years. But the problem in recent years, and especially over the past 5 years, is the difficulty of U.S. naval shipyards to fulfill the requests for ship orders and deliver them on time. I mean, that problem is the worst I've seen in the 30 years I have been CBO's naval analyst. The U.S. Navy today is 295 ships. If we had simply been able to build ships on the same schedule as we were able to build them 10 or 15 years ago, we'd have a Navy that is well over 300 ships. We're down some 20 ships, most of which are attack submarines and destroyers, compared to where we would have otherwise have been if our industrial base, shipbuilding industrial base, was simply performing at the same level as performing 15 years ago.
And Eric, what explains the poorer performance now than before in the United States?
There's a lot of issues that are going into sort of the challenges that the U.S. shipbuilding industrial base is having. But far and away, in my judgment, the biggest one is labor. There's 7 major yards that build ships for the U.S. Navy. And pretty much all of those yards, to one degree or another, are having trouble attracting and then especially retaining the workers that they hire. Attrition rates at these yards for their average touch labor force is like 20%. And in some of the critical trades, such as pipe fitters, welders, ship fitters, those attrition rates have been at 30% in many of these yards. And when that's happening, your workforce is sort of, to use the term in a different way, it's evergreen. You're always going to have a green workforce because it's basically turning over on average every 3 years or so. What that causes is an increase in the number of labor hours that you need to build ships, which then therefore takes more time to build those ships. The greener workforce means that there's more rework involved, which again adds more time it takes to build these ships, and it requires more oversight. So we used to build destroyers and amphibious assault ships at 5 years, attack submarines at 6 years. Today, it takes us 9 years to build those ships. That is making it very difficult for the U.S. to build the larger Navy that it says it has wanted and needed for the past 20 years or so.
Can I add one thing on there that I think is really, really great thing that Eric brought up that I think is hugely important in framing the issue, and that is the ability to be ready for production. And this is something that we've seen in the Chinese context, in which they don't want to suspend operations at shipyards because they recognize that it makes you less efficient and it's costly to restart things. And so there's something of a cyclical pattern at the shipyards that we studied in which, if there's a flood of commercial orders that come in, the capacity gets turned over to that. And then once those orders are fulfilled, turning that capacity back to a lot of the naval production. But there is definitely an effort to sustain a high level of activity at these shipyards. And I think that's one of the sort of unique benefits that comes out in the Chinese case. Like, they are ready to produce, right? They have the means to execute on it. And personnel is a big part of that as well, as Eric mentioned.
And let's be clear, though, that's not the problem in the U.S. industry. The U.S. naval industry has got a pretty robust order book. The problem is that these shipyards are competing for workers for other sectors, even the retail sectors and the service sector and other manufacturers, where for a variety of reasons over time, pay has become compressed so that you can make almost the same amount of money going to work for Subway or Target as you can as an entry-level worker in a shipyard. And so if that's your choice as an 18 or 19-year-old, who wants to go work in the hot, cold, dirty shipyard when you can... Dangerous, when you can go work at Target or Subway or some other manufacturing company that's got, simply better working conditions. And so there needs to be a much greater pay differential between those service sector and other manufacturing jobs and the shipyards to be able to attract and especially retain those workers so we can get the skills up and the efficiency and the production back to where we need it to be.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
There's an awful lot of discussion, which we should have, about the reviving the commercial shipbuilding industry in the United States. I think there are, pros and cons to that. There's challenges to that. One of the pros, if you will, would be the one that Matthew mentioned earlier about logistics. We want to have enough sort of commercial ships in the United States that it provides some kind of a reserve of logistics capability in the event that the United States is engaged in some sort of, long or longish war with another power, whether that's China or somebody else. But at the same time, given that labor is sort of our chief problem in making the U.S. shipbuilding industrial base work better than it is, you would have to spend a lot of money, public money, taxpayer money, to revive commercial shipbuilding industry in the United States. Again, where would those workers come from? Then you run the risk of sort of competing with the naval shipyards. These commercial yards will compete with the naval shipyards for the same types of workers and the same types of skills that are needed to complete Navy warships. The question of commercial shipbuilding is a complicated one, and it's not something that is easily resolved, in my opinion, on one side or the other.
And I think that's a good segue to the last portion of the podcast to look at what are potential broad policy options for the United States going forward, both in terms of strengthening our industrial capacity, but also either countering or competing with China, given its dual-use shipyards. Eric, maybe I can turn to you first. You outlined a couple of them in your foreign affairs articles. If you could share that with us here, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first one I would mention here for the podcast is something I mentioned in testimony when I was testifying before Congress on these issues a few weeks ago. And we have already covered it, so I won't go into it, which is fixing the labor problem in the shipyards, improving pay, benefits, quality of life issues to reduce workforce attrition. That's really critical. Now, beyond that, there are policy options that we can consider to allow the U.S. Navy to grow larger and to be able to compete more effectively with China where possible. One is something that, President Trump himself mentioned in an interview in December, which, perhaps we need to buy warships from our allies. I mentioned earlier that the Korean manufacturer was suggesting doing exactly that. That's an issue that's worth talking about, having a public debate about. It would require a change in law by the Congress. But as Hyundai suggested, if it could build up to 5 Aegis-capable destroyers for the U.S. Navy per year, that would be an effective addition to the U.S. Navy. Japan could produce frigates. The Mugami-class frigate that Japan produces, pretty nifty ship. Whereas in the U.S., we're trying to build a frigate and we're not succeeding very well for a variety of reasons. The Coast Guard needs icebreakers. Finland could produce icebreakers. But again, there are advantages and disadvantages to that option, and it's something, but it is worth sort of talking more about. Another option that I discuss in the article with Steve Biddle is that the U.S. could design a smaller warship, like a corvette or a smaller frigate than what is currently on the books, so that could be built in shipyards in the United States that are not currently already building Navy ships. That would, in a sense, expand the Navy's shipbuilding portfolio, both in terms of the ships that it builds, but also the yards that it's using. That's something that is definitely worth talking about in more detail. And likewise, and this is something that has been on the books for the Navy for a while, is moving more vigorously into unmanned platforms. There are a lot of other shipyards that can do unmanned platforms. The Navy has been working on this issue, but it does sort of feel like that there is kind of a churn in that area, and it's not clear that we're making a whole lot of progress so far about figuring out what exactly we want unmanned platforms to do, which ones we want to buy, and then buying them and building them and getting them out to the fleet in substantial quantity.
And Eric, of these 4 different options, from your perspective, do you think we could pursue all 4 simultaneously? And which of these options do you think are probably most difficult for the United States?
Well, I think we could definitely pursue all 4 of those options simultaneously. And I think the difficulties vary. In the case of buying warships from our friends and allies, that's just something that we have not done. I can't tell you off the top of my head, when, if ever, we've done that. It's certainly not something we have not done for the last 30 to 40 years. That has been, enshrined in law that we don't do that warships for the United States Navy must be built in U.S. yards. So there would be political challenges sort of making that change. The raising of wages for shipyard workers, I think that is probably the easiest thing that we can implement and something that might have the most immediate beneficial effect, improving the producibility of the ships that are already under construction in U.S. naval yards. The options about incorporating more unmanned systems or maybe a new, smaller combatant, such as like a missile corvette, is one of the things that I talk about. That's something that would take a little bit of time because we'd have to get a design, perhaps buy a design. We can buy designs from other countries, but building them here and then giving them to shipyards in the United States that perhaps have not built combatants for the United States Navy before, they would have a steep learning curve. So that would take a little bit of time for them to sort of figure out how to do that. But it is an option that is on the table, and it is something that other countries, they build missile corvettes all the time. So it is something that maybe the United States wants to consider, particularly as it talks about building, a larger, more distributed fleet to get its offensive capability put across more platforms. A smaller combatant, it seems like, is an option worth considering. Essentially puts more eggs in more baskets rather than putting all the eggs, all the offensive capability in a smaller number of ships.
Matthew, I now want to turn to you for a similar question. Your report also offers recommendations for how the U.S. government can refine its approach to better counter China. Can you highlight some of your top recommendations?
Thanks, Bonnie. The issue really has become a pretty big bipartisan issue. And there's both, support on the Hill for addressing the issue and also from the executive branch. But before getting into the policies specifically, I think it's important just to reiterate what the challenges are for the United States, because we're really far behind, right? And a lot of the policies that are sort of coming into play now are talking about how does the U.S. become or revitalize its shipbuilding industry? How does it become a major player in shipbuilding? But even, something like a 50 times increase would only get the U.S. to like 5% of global production. So it's a massive challenge. And, I'm not entirely sure that's exactly what the U.S. should be shooting for. It really should be trying to solidify some of its security concerns, both economic and national security, rather than just straight up competing with China. And the other factor there that I think matters is that there's limited leverage for the United States, right? It's not a major player, so it doesn't have the same stake in the market as it does in some other industries. So it's hard, right? It's hard for the U.S. to really come up with effective policies to address this issue. But I think you can categorize U.S. government actions really into two buckets, right? There's actions that are designed, and then they overlap. There's blurring between them. But on one hand, you have disrupting China's dominance in the shipbuilding industry, and then also investing in the U.S. industrial base. And some of the sort of early movement that we sort of saw with this was back in April of last year, April 2024, when U.S.to initiated a 301 investigation into China's shipbuilding sector. And really, it was looking to try to understand, did China use unfair practices to gain an upper hand there? And their report that came out in January of this year, so January 2025, basically said yes to that, right? It said that China had targeted maritime logistics and shipbuilding for dominance, and the efforts that they did to put themselves in the place they are today were unreasonable, and they had created burdens for the U.S. and were thus actionable. I fast forward a few months, and in April, I think April 17th, U.S.to came out with a fee regime that's designed to levy port fees on Chinese ships, Chinese shipping companies that arrive at U.S. ports. And different versions of this were sort of talked about over the last few months, right? And what we're seeing now is maybe a little bit more restrained than some of the sort of earlier proposals. And I think there was quite a bit of pushback against that and how that would affect not just Chinese shipping companies, but also European shipping companies, Japanese shipping companies, and the effect that would have on the US market as well. And that port fee structure, that'll be going into place later this year. And there's, remission of fees for companies that, conduct orders at U.S. shipyards and other sort of factors that are in there. So that's kind of one bucket of policies you have in place. And then you also have the President Trump released a pretty significant executive order also in April on shipbuilding, which in essence serves as a framework for how USG will begin to pursue the multi-decade effort of revitalizing the U.S. shipbuilding industry. It sort of sets up a plan for structuring interagency coordination, public-private partnerships, bringing in allies and working with them, and also building up our domestic workforce. And so that's all that's really kind of getting talked about. What I'd say for our specific policy recommendations, really what we argue is that U.S.to and really all aspects of the U.S. government really need to take an approach that addresses both the national security and the economic challenges together. And I kind of made this point earlier, right? You can't separate those. China certainly doesn't separate them. And so when we're coming up with policy, we really need to think about how do we address those. And for us, the big thing we advocate for in the report is we need to prioritize how to disrupt China's dual-use shipbuilding ecosystem, right? So that it cannot continue to benefit from financing and technology that are coming into it from other democracies, especially from U.S. allies. That, to us, is really where we need to start thinking a little bit more concretely about specific policies and what we can do about them.
Additionally, on the Hill, the updated bipartisan Ships for America Act was just released, which put significant resources behind these efforts. Could you talk a bit about what this legislation will mean?
Yeah, 100%, right? So the SHIPS Act is where a lot of the other movement is happening. And it's co-sponsored by Senator Mark Kelly and Todd Young. It was reintroduced in April 30th. And it really tries to put sort of legislative power behind a lot of the things that you see mentioned in the executive order, looking at things like investments and tax credits, the workforce, and developing a strategic support fleet, which is one of the areas we had sort of touched on earlier. As it's currently drafted, it proposes a additional fee structure for assessing port fees. So really assessing fees based off of shipyard where the ship was built rather than just the origin of the ship itself. And it includes specifically discussion of, making sure there's a list of shipyards of concern, mainly those that are tied to CSSC and potentially other actors as well. It's unclear currently how exactly that's going to interact with USTR's fees, but they sort of propose this alternative structure that could kind of maybe be levied on top of the USTR fees. There's still a little bit of ambiguity about that. But that to us is really great news because that was one of the things we stressed in our report, that if we want to look at this issue in a way that best addresses U.S. national security, the focus shouldn't just be on ships. Certainly we can have some of the emphasis on ships, but we want the emphasis to be on the shipyards themselves that are producing these ships, and specifically targeting Chinese shipyards that are inherently dual use in nature, right? That are producing these large commercial ships, these large ocean-going vessels, and also producing service combatants for the PLA. For us, it's a really important distinction, right? Because China is really just too important to the market in the short term to say you can't have any ships from China. And, we went to great depths in the report to lay out a tiered system of tier 1, tier 2 shipyards. These are the ones that are either dual use shipyards or closely associated with dual use shipyards. And foreign companies should be extraordinarily wary about the risk of funneling money and technology into those shipyards. But there are other tiers to the classification system we came up with as well. So tier 3 shipyards being the ones that are also state-owned, but appear from all evidence that we have access to be engaged entirely in commercial production. And then tier 4 shipyards, which are, and you can't see me doing the air quotes here because it's a podcast, but privately owned shipyards in China. And there's some concerns obviously with that, but they're definitely lower down on the scale of the risk assessment. And so focusing on the shipyards and recognizing that, at 50% of global production, you can't just tell companies tomorrow, no ships from China, but targeting the ones that we think are the biggest problem, targeting the ones that support China's military modernization, gives us a little bit more of a scalpel versus a sledgehammer approach, which I do think will help to deliver less negative outcomes for the U.S. and allies and give us some positive momentum to building to where we're trying to get. Some of the other recommendations that I think are key that pop up in different parts of legislation is the need to work with allies and partners, right? Japan and South Korea, and also, our friends in Europe, right? We're going to need to have a number of different types of cooperative agreements to rebuild the U.S. industry and also find areas where there can be joint ventures and other types of technology exchanges that could be beneficial to both sides. It's certainly a big challenge, and I don't want to make it seem like it's not one. The most important thing really is going to be the sustained effort in maintaining the focus on shipbuilding over time from one administration to the next. But, even though we are in a highly polarized environment, the good news here really is that shipbuilding seems to be one of the areas where there is pretty broad bipartisan support.
Great, thank you. So one question for you guys before we wrap this up is, Eric, you mentioned about unmanned platforms, and I think kind of like the nuclear question, do we even need these larger ships, or are we moving to more unmanned, smaller maritime platforms?
I'm happy to offer a few thoughts on that. I think because of the nature of the way the U.S. Navy fights and operates is that it operates overseas and, thousands of miles from U.S. shores most of the time. And as a result of that, it really does probably need more of a hybrid fleet in the sense that you don't want to have a fleet that's composed of all high-end combatants without smaller, more inexpensive, more attritable systems such as unmanned systems that you refer to. But at the same time, that's not to say that these large warships are no longer useful for the U.S. Navy, because when you're operating thousands of miles away, you're going to need the robustness that comes with large and more capable warships operating in conjunction or deploying those smaller, more attritable systems for the conduct of the future of naval warfare. The Navy's got to figure out how it wants to do all that, but it really isn't an either-or situation. There was a recent article that was written by Dr. Stephen Wills of the Center for Maritime Studies, and he makes this precise argument where you do need kind of a hybrid fleet, because going all in on just smaller attritable systems, if you're having a war in the Western Pacific, how do you get all those unmanned systems over there? And how do you use them? How do you operate them? How do you incorporate the offensive punch into them? And so that's why I would say that going forward, given the way naval warfare has evolved, you need both. If the United States were only worried about defending its coast, then I would say the need for large warships is not nearly as great as it still currently is, but that is not, nor is it likely to be in the foreseeable future, the way the U.S. Navy is going to be operating.
Thank you very much, Eric and Matthew, for this fascinating discussion on a topic that is generating significant interest in Washington and elsewhere. For those who wish to learn more about this, please read Eric's Foreign Affairs piece and Matthew's CSIS report. Thank you for joining me again.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being on the podcast, and I've enjoyed the discussion.